The primary concept and theme of Real Injun is the examination of the portrayal of Indigenous peoples of North America in film. The message of representation is reoccurring throughout. The portrayals range from sympathetic and heroic to barbaric. Even when Indigenous people are portrayed accurately and with great care, they are often in the service to the Caucasian story. Pocahontas and Dances with Wolves may be genuine in intent. They may even be good films, but they are not Aboriginal films. Cree filmmaker Neil Diamond achieved his goal of exploring his own history and Indigenous history in film. Throughout, we are given insights into the depiction of Indigenous peoples on screen and how the vast majority of Indigenous depictions were portrayed by Caucasians. These Caucasian depictions shaped much of the popular culture and perception of Indigenous people. The film displays the history and evolution of Indigenous stereotypes as they evolve over time. In the early 1900s, during the silent film era, Indigenous actors were common and many were filmed in a sympathetic light. The Silent Enemy was a very authentic film during this time, which displays the dwindling Indigenous population through the metaphor of starvation. These portrayals took a turn in the 1930s to display the cowboys as heroic and the Indigenous as savage. It was also during this time that Caucasian actors began to portray Indigenous characters. Iron Eyes Cody is the most famous of these actors. He fit the image of the Plains Indian in the eyes of the public. He was actually Italian, but he did seem to have a genuine affection for Indigenous people. Come to the 1960s and the popularity of hippies, Indigenous people become sympathetic again, as an allegory for the civil rights movement. Genuine representation remained rare, however. In 1973, during the Academy Awards, Marlon Brando refused his award with Sacheen Littlefeather to draw attention to the treatment of American Indians in the film industry and the recent happenings at Wounded Knee. From this point on, we see more depth to Indigenous characters. The 1990s in particular, we see a rise in Indigenous representation, though real Indigenous stories are limited. Of note is the 2001 film, The Fast Runner. It is said to be one of the most authentic Indigenous stories. Real Injun does not try to shame the audience who may or may not be the most culturally aware. The whole venture has a relatively light tone throughout, focusing on the history and evolution of Indigenous and Caucasian views. This tone makes the darker subject matter of discrimination easier to digest while still educating the audience. The film Hostiles opens in 1892 with a Caucasian homestead family being attacked by Comanche, who burn down her home, kill her husband and 3 children before she escapes. The very following scene shows our protagonist, Captain Joseph Blocker, capturing and torturing an Apache family before literally dragging them to Fort Beringer and imprisoning them without a trial. However, the main plot of the film centers on Captain Blocker escorting a dying Cheyenne chief, Yellowhawk, and his family to their tribal lands in Montana. The two have a violent history with each other, but must weather the threats of nature and man on the long journey north. Throughout Hostiles, the overarching theme is the vicious cycle of hate which emerges from conflicts, in particular conflicts between people of different cultures. Every single character, both Caucasian and Indigenous, are damaged in some way by the conflict. A damaged person in turn creates more hostility in an unending cycle. It paints a dangerous and depressing picture of the West in the late 1800s. Scott Cooper directed, produced, and wrote the film Hostiles. This singular vision of a violent and desolate West in the 1800s is exemplified throughout. Nearly every character we are introduced to dies in a violent manner as a result of prejudice or intolerance. During the climax of Act 3, Blocker is burying Chief Yellowhawk on his tribal land in Montana, only for Caucasian landowners to attack them for trespassing on their land. In this confrontation, Blocker loses the rest of his men, and almost all of Yellowhawk's remaining kin are slaughtered. A system of violence and ownership has led Blocker down this path, only to culminate in him losing almost everything. While the plot and characters in the film are fictional, there are elements based on real history, though dates have been shifted slightly. Captain Blocker and Chief Yellowhawk were said to have been fierce rivals at the Battle of Wounded Knee. While this provides motivation for our characters' hostility, the actual battle took place in 1890 and was a massacre of mostly women and children. There was a real struggle during this time to reconcile the treatment of Indigenous peoples and supposed civility of Americans. James P. Boyd's book, Red Men on the Warpath, takes a surprisingly sympathetic view of Indigenous people, especially compared to contemporaries of the time. Boyd's subheader, The Peculiar and Interesting Life, Manners, Customs, Beliefs, and Ceremonials of North American Indians, exemplifies this yearning for understanding in a time highlighted by battles and blood. While the film's depiction of First Nations can be simplistic, with Comanche being one-dimensional villains and Chief Yellowhawk too often being portrayed as cliché, noble, and stoic, there are brief moments when the chief's violent history with Blocker are explored. The source of the hostility which caused the divide between the two men and nations also created them. They were shaped by each other, many times negatively. In the end, Blocker accepts the harms he has both committed and suffered as part of him, and with Yellowhawk's death, he is losing a part of himself. It can't be said that this film doesn't rely on stereotypes, but for certain Indigenous characters there's a greater depth than many other media depictions. That said, this is still a Caucasian story with the main character who is Caucasian. We see his internal struggles, but the film would have benefited from allocating more time to the struggles of Yellowhawk and his family. There is sensitivity towards the plight of the Indigenous peoples throughout the film to the point where it becomes too overt and heavy-handed. There are Caucasian characters who will nearly turn to the screen and proselytize on how Indigenous are being treated. This occurs numerous times, and while earnest, feels out of place on the hard western frontier. The moments between Yellowhawk and Captain Blocker were genuine, though. Both men had committed crimes against the other, murdering friends and family. While the European incursion into Indigenous lands is the initial conflict, the violence that followed broke both men. All the men in Blocker's command have been tainted by war. One in particular complains of having a case of melancholia, which is dismissed by others. He's later seen begging Chief Yellowhawk for forgiveness just before committing suicide. Hostiles is not a perfect representation of Indigenous people, but nor is it terrible. I found the film flawed in its representation, much in the same way every character in the film is chipped and broken in some aspect. I believe it does help contribute to a better cross-cultural understanding despite these flaws. There seemed to have been a conscious effort not to depict a single side as paragons.